Hello, and welcome back to the World of Wysteria. Tonight, I will be reading chapter 27, and this will be presented in two parts. Wysteria, chapter 27. "Greetings," said Emily, as Will emerged in the square the next night. "Beat you?" "Yes, you did. But I took a detour," he told her. "You tried your bouncing thing again?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I figured it was one way for me to practice moving in and out of the dark." Will informed her that tonight he'd managed to redirect himself from the outer grounds of the castle to the plaza, with no aid from the blonde woman. "Excellent," she said. "You were able to navigate on your own. I think that's a good sign." He did as well. Just as they began discussing their plans for the day, Will felt a sudden rift in his world. "Someone's coming," he said, stepping close to Emily. "Who?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," he answered, knowing only that his borders had been breached. "A stranger?" "No," he replied, detecting a now familiar scent and relaxing his guard. "It's Jeremy." And as Will pronounced his name, he appeared, materializing just a few feet in front of them. "Good morning," said Emily. "Is it?" Jeremy replied, looking up at the sky. "Is it what?" she asked. "Morning," he said. Emily took a peek at the clock tower. "No, actually it's afternoon," she said, correcting herself. "At least here. But good, nonetheless." "Yes," she answered. "And things have been good since I saw you last?" he asked. Will and Emily exchanged knowing looks. "Well," said Emily, as Will chuckled under his breath. "I guess you haven't heard then." Jeremy nodded. "That would be my guess as well," he responded. "We had guests," she told him. "Did you? How nice," he said. Emily giggled. "Not really. They were uninvited and ill-behaved." "Ah, I see," said Jeremy. "Then there is a story which, as we both correctly guessed, I have not heard. So..." He paused, thought for a moment, then began looking around the plaza. "Is there some place we could sit?" he asked. Will turned his head and stared at the green door of the tavern. Though it was the obvious option, he hesitated and looked at Emily, who, after a quick glance toward the door, shrugged her shoulders as if to say, "Why not?" "Yes," he answered. "This way." Will led his guests across the square to Lily's establishment and escorted them inside. The tavern was quiet and nearly empty today. There were only 2 customers in the room, a pair of middle-aged men sitting at the bar, conversing in low tones. "Good afternoon," the bartender greeted them. "Please have a seat wherever you want. I'll be with you directly." Will nodded and thanked him, then asked Jeremy if he cared where they sat. "By the fire," he said. They walked to the back of the room and took seats around a table near the hearth. As Will sat down in his chair, he smiled, glancing down at the iron cauldron, which had been put back in its proper place. Charming, said Jeremy, surveying the room. A fine setting for the telling of a tale. It's perfect, particularly for this tale, Emily remarked. Is it? He said. The barkeep now approached, carrying a small oil lamp, which he placed in the center of their table, then lit. Now, what can I get for you? He asked. Nothing for me, thank you, said Emily. And for you, sir? He said, turning to Jeremy. Oh, surprise me, he replied in an offhand manner. The man seemed befuddled and looked at Will for clarification. What they're drinking will be fine, said Will, motioning toward the men at the bar. Very good, sir, he said, adding in a whisper that he might have something better stashed behind the counter. While they waited for their drinks, Jeremy took out his pipe and charged it with tobacco. He produced a match and held it just above the glass chimney of the lamp until it burst into flame. Then, bringing it to the bowl, he puffed, filling the air with sweet, earthy smoke. Their host soon returned, carrying 2 tankards of frothy liquid. Our best ale, he said, setting them on the table in front of the men. Are you sure I can't get you anything, milady? He asked Emily. Not at the moment, she told him. Well, please call out if you need anything, he said, before returning to his patrons at the bar. Jeremy took a small sip from the tall cup and licked his lips, nodding as if the taste were acceptable. He drank again, more deeply, then set down the beverage and resumed puffing on his pipe. Now, he said, watching the smoke roll from his lips, tell me about this visit from your unwelcome guests. Will and Emily looked at each other. Go ahead, she said to him. It's your turn. It actually took place here, in this room, Will began. Ah, I see, said Jeremy, now grasping the meaning behind Emily's enigmatic comment. Will then told the tale of their encounter with the 2 strangers, making only a passing reference to Lily's role in the story and not mentioning her by name, while Jeremy sat quietly and listened. When he'd finished describing the fight, ending with the villain's hasty retreat from Wysteria, Will stopped and waited for Jeremy's reaction. Jeremy leaned back in his chair, nodding his head as he stared up at the ceiling. A lively episode, he said. Very good. You did well. We think those gentlemen were bounty hunters, said Emily. We spoke to Charlotte yesterday, and she informed us that I'm wanted, that Nathan has offered some kind of reward for my capture. This I have heard, Jeremy replied. In fact, the purpose of my visit today was to bring you this information. Apparently, Charlotte knows one of them, she told him, the younger man, who arrived first and seemed to be in charge. She thinks he may have overheard her talking to friends about her visit here to Wysteria. She said his name was Daniel, and that he was able to find us because he's a tracker. I see, said Jeremy. I believe I know the young man in question. Not well, but we've met. From what I understand, he is a skilled explorer and would be capable of locating this place. Charlotte didn't recognize the henchman who attacked Will, said Emily. His friend called him Anton. Anton, he said. Interesting. Then you know him? Will asked. Yes, he answered, the corners of his mouth wrinkling into a smile. I have crossed paths with him. Jeremy paused to take a drink from his cup. You have met and defeated a talented adversary, he said, grinning at Will. He must have been quite shocked. I myself would not have bet on you. When he tackled me, I thought I was done for, Will confessed. If it weren't for Lily, who knows what have happened? Lily, the woman who came to my aid during the fight, he said. She runs this place. She's an interesting character. How so? Jeremy inquired. Well, just then, on cue, the back door swung open and in walked Lily, tying a white apron around her waist. She headed toward the front of the room, appearing not to notice them. But after taking several steps, she stopped and looked in their direction. Why, good afternoon, she said, smiling brightly. What a pleasant surprise. For several seconds she stood there, staring into Will's eyes as if they were the only two in the room. Then, following a soft sigh, she looked at Emily, acknowledging her presence with a polite nod. Emily smiled in return. Lily then lifted her gaze to Jeremy. I don't believe I've had the pleasure, she said, strolling over to their table. Jeremy set his pipe down and rose from his seat. This is Jeremy, said Will, a friend of ours. Lily, she said, introducing herself. She then tendered him her hand, which he took and touched to his lips. Charmed, he replied. We were just telling Jeremy about the brawl with our unruly visitors the other day, Will said to her. Ah, yes, said Lily. It was quite harrowing. Would you care to join us? Jeremy asked, gesturing to the unoccupied chair next to him. Lily glanced around the room. Perhaps for a few minutes, she said, taking the seat he offered. Jeremy sat down and took up his pipe. Will tells me you came to his rescue during the attack, he said. You're a brave young woman. Lily smiled shyly. What kind of hostess would I be if I suffered my patrons to be harmed by ruffians, she replied. I'm sure any loyal citizen would have done the same for our much-beloved Lord. Did they? He asked her. Lily looked at him quizzically. Pardon? Were you the only one here at the time? The only bystander? Ah, she said, now seeing his point. Well, no, but it all happened very quickly, and I was close by. It was a modest answer, for Will remembered everyone else in the room diving for cover when the fight began, and hiding until the villains had left. Not that he blamed them. Still, said Jeremy. The front door then opened, and two well-dressed couples entered the room. I should see to my guests, said Lily. She slid her chair back from the table and stood. Jeremy rose as well, prompting Will and Emily to do the same. It was nice to meet you, she said to Jeremy. The pleasure was mine, he replied, with a courteous bow. Lily looked across the table at Will, capturing his eyes once again. "As always," she said. Then, after a quick, obligatory nod to Emily, she walked to the front of the room to greet her customers. And we will take a quick break right here, and we'll return in a moment with part 2.